welcome to another exciting lecture in medical terminology. Now, if you've been with me so far, you know that we've been studying chapters 1 through 4, where we learned about prefixes, suffixes, some combining forms, and also some terms pertaining to the body as a whole. So if we were to use the analogy of a manual stick shift car, we were in gears 1 or 2, but now we're going to shift gears. And starting with chapter 5 on throughout the rest of the course, we're going to begin to apply a lot of what we've learned from the previous chapters into the organ systems. So now we're ready to shift into gear 7. Are you ready? Well, I'm absolutely ready to go. And so let's go ahead and get started with our first major organ system, known as the digestive system. Here are some of the goals that we hope to accomplish by the end of the lecture. Name the organs of the digestive system and describe their locations and functions. Define combining forms for organs and know the meanings of related terminology. And describe signs, symptoms, and disease conditions affecting this digestive system. We're also going to start talking about some of the pathology, some of the clinical diagnoses or diagnostic tests, clinical procedures, and many other things as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Once again, we're moving toward applying our medical terminology to the major organ systems of our body. So we will not only study the specific terms pertaining to the medical terminology, but also their applications of the term. So let's go ahead and start applying these and becoming masters in medical terminology. So the digestive or gastrointestinal system performs 4 main functions, but first of all, let me go ahead and get you started. Every living organism on this planet has to be able to attain food energy, chemical energies from the environment, or sometimes even light energy from the environment in order to power their cells to do work, in order to power their bodies, in order to power the organism to do a lot of the things that they need to do in order to survive and reproduce in this very, very harsh world. Now, one of the ways they do that, once again, is to attain the energy from the foods that they eat, and the system that's responsible for breaking down and transferring the energy to their bodies, to the organism, is known as, for us, the digestive system, or medically speaking, the gastrointestinal system. Now, there are 4 main functions, as you can see here on this slide. Now, basically speaking, you have to eat the food, you got to break down the food, then you have to absorb the food, and then whatever is left over that you don't use has to get taken out. So medically speaking, the first step here would be ingestion, which is you eat the food. Second step here would be digestion, which you're breaking down the food. Third step here is absorption, which you're taking in the food or the energy. And then the fourth step here is letting go of what you don't use, or elimination. Let's go ahead and talk about these in a little bit more detail. When you're ingesting food material, for humans at least, when you're ingesting, food material is taken into the mouth, your oral cavity. Now, there are 2 processes that happen in here. First of all, you have to mechanically break down this massive piece of food into smaller chunks so that your cells can take them in much more easily. Can you imagine if you had a piece of steak and you just slapped it on top of your skin and said, you know what? I need some energy now. Absorb right now. Absorb it straight into the skin, please. That piece of steak, absorb me now. It's not going to work that way, guys. The first thing you got to do is you got to chew that block of steak, or chew the foods that you need to eat, and break them down to smaller bits and pieces. The medical term for chewing is mastication. Mastication there. Now be very careful with the pronunciation of this word, okay? Mastication. Repeat after me. Mastication with a T. Now, after you've chewed down the foods and you've broken them down to smaller molecules, then the next step is you have to push it down into your stomach. You got to bring it down there. So the word for that, obviously we know it as swallowing, but the medical term here is known as deglutition. Deglutition. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of clear that up a little bit so we can read that. All right, so deglutition here is that process known as swallowing. So you chew the food, you masticate your food, and then you have to swallow your food. Deglutinate your food. Now, once the food goes down, it goes down through this tube known as the esophagus, which begins at the oral cavity or your mouth, and then it ends up, goes straight down into your stomach. It's It's just a tube. And it's very amazing because the esophagus, so here we go, check this out. You do here have your mouth. That's my picture of a mouth, so bear with me. And then you have this tube that goes on down, and then now you have here this sac known as a stomach. This here is known as the esophagus. And the esophagus, again, is that tube. It has muscles around it in order to squeeze and push the food down into the stomach. So if you want to imagine like a toothpaste, a tube of toothpaste, and you're trying to squeeze the toothpaste out so you get it on your toothbrush, that's pretty much what's going on with the food. There's some sort of squeezing action going on to push that food on down. It doesn't just drop into your stomach, okay? That's one of the reasons why if someone were to, maybe lie on their side or even be upside down, if they were to swallow food, there's a good chance that they will be able to push that food down into the stomach even though they're upside down because there are those muscles there. That process of muscular contraction in that particular tube and being able to push foods down into there is known as peristalsis. Peristalsis, we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Once the food lands into the stomach, it's not just enough that we chew it, but we have to chemically break it down. Now your stomach also can mechanically break down these foods. It does a lot of the squishing action in there, and you have a lot of, in order to chemically break it down, you have a lot of enzymes in there like peptidases that break those down. So those are known as digestive enzymes, and enzymes for the most part are protein. And they break down complex nutrients. For example, if you have big blocks of steak or protein in there, a lot of the peptidases, a lot of these enzymes in your stomach will break them down into small little building blocks known as amino acids. If you have carbohydrates, or in our textbook they shorthanded it for sugars, but if you have any carbs or carbohydrate in your stomach, then you have a lot of enzymes in there that will break them down into simple carbohydrates, or known as monosaccharides. They'll break them down into monosaccharides such as glucose or fructose. If you have fats, or also known as lipids, excuse me there. You have any lipids, then also known as fats, these will break down into fatty acids or triglycerides. A lot more detail about that in a first semester non-majors or majors biology course, but for now we're just going to keep it simple. All right. Now, once your stomach breaks them down, not only mechanically, but also chemically, and don't forget your mouth also breaks down foods mechanically, mainly your teeth breaks them down mechanically, but you also have in your mouth saliva, which contains an enzyme known as amylase, which breaks down large carbohydrates into maybe smaller chunks, not necessarily monosaccharides, excuse me, but breaks them down into more manageable chunks. Now, once they're broken down, your stomach then brings them in, squeezes them into your intestines, where absorption takes place. Your digestive food passes then into your intestines, where your intestines absorb those foods into the bloodstream through the lining cells, through their own lining cells. Now, once they do, then the nutrient travels throughout the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream transfers that through these structures known as capillaries. We'll talk more about that in the circulatory system, but the food transfers across that pipeline into your tissue cells, into your tissue cells, where they start to take advantage of the foods that you eat. Then the cells take this food, they burn those molecules down, and then releases that energy out from those food molecules to be used for their cellular metabolism or other kinds of cellular work. Now, nothing is perfect in this world. It's not that you eat foods and that every chemical block of energy that's in those foods gets absorbed into your body and gets used up. Nothing is 100% perfect. All of you physics majors out there know that an engine is not 100% perfect. Our bodies are very similar to that kind of engine. The foods that we eat, they don't always get used up all the way. So sometimes you have waste products that are a result of that, any leftover foods that the body's not going to use. Now it's time to get rid of those, and that process is known as elimination. Now the body then eliminates solid waste material. And that's a good one there. Solid waste materials in the form of feces that cannot be absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, the large intestines also then concentrates that. Again, it concentrates it into feces, and then the waste then passes out through the body and through this structure known as the anus. Now let's go ahead and backtrack and start here with the oral cavity. Now the oral cavity, the gastrointestinal tract begins of course with the oral cavity. As you can see, if we were to look inside the mouth, we see some very familiar structures that you probably have seen in front of your own mirror. We definitely do have gums, okay, not chewing gums, like gum to keep your mouth fresh. I'm talking about dental gums, okay? So the medical combining form for gums, of course, is gingivo. You'll see that here on this chart, gingivo. So if you were to have an inflammation of your gums, what would the medical term be for that? You've probably heard of it before. Lots of it on television. It's known as gingivitis. Okay, gingivitis, itis means inflammation. Gingivo, of course, we definitely know means gums. So the next time you hear the word gingivitis, they're talking about inflammation of the gums. We also have teeth here, and if you look on the other side of the chart here, it's it's denti or odonto. So a dentist is a specialist of your teeth. There's definitely on the top portion of the mouth right over here, that is the hard palate. And then we have back there is known as the soft palate. You can even try to scope around with your tongue. You'll feel the hard palate at the very top. And if you kind of squeeze in the back, you'll kind of feel a soft region back there. That would be your soft palate. In the back, it looks like a punching bag at the gym. That would be known as the uvula. On the side, we definitely have tonsils. Here we have the cheeks, and these will be the inner cheeks. The medical combining form for that would be bucco. And then you definitely have the pharynx, which is there in the back. We definitely have the tongue, which contains a lot of taste buds. Different regions of your tongue are very good at recognizing different kinds of tastes. For example, sweetness and sourness and bitterness. Your tongue has different regions there. And a lot of the little dots in your tongue are known as taste buds. And those are the ones that have those chemical receptors in order to detect what kind of taste is going on in there. And of course, on the outer regions here, we have the lips. If we were to break down all of the tissues, the soft tissues that are surrounding there, we will come down here with the upper teeth within the dental arc. Definitely this would be known as the medial line, okay, which is that centermost line there. And if we were to go out, we were talking about the two front teeth, those would be known as the central incisors. And then to the right or to the left of that, that would be known as the lateral incisors. And then the special ones here, those vampire teeth, are known as the canine teeth. For us as humans, our canine teeth aren't pronounced, but for vampires, most definitely, they're definitely pronounced there. Or if you have a pet dog, or if you have a pet cat or something, you can go ahead and take a look at their teeth. They definitely have pronounced canine teeth. One of the reasons why dogs are known as canines is because of their canine teeth. After the canine teeth, we have the first premolar, and then you have the second premolar, and then these three portions here will be known as the molars. We definitely have the first, the second, and then the third molars here as well. Now here's another two words here. If we were to look here, we know that on our teeth we have that sharp edge. Those would be known as the incisal edge. And then on the more toward the flat end of it, that would be known as a mesial surface, and then of course toward the distal part of that would be the distal surface. If we're talking about the side of the oral cavity that's toward the tongue, okay, toward the tongue, that would be known as the lingual. And if we're talking about the side that's toward the cheeks or toward the outside of the face, that would be known as buccal. More specifically toward the cheeks, because your cheeks are sitting out here. So therefore they call it the buccal region. Let's go ahead and take a look at the teeth. The main tissues responsible for mechanically breaking down your foods, from a big cookie, say, to like these this bolus or this mass of food. Okay, that would be your teeth. And let's go ahead and take a look at the anatomy of the teeth. We definitely have the enamel. The enamel is this outer covering that protects the dentin layer. And one of the unfortunate things here is that if you drink a lot of acidic foods, taking a lot of acidic foods like orange juice or like Coke soda, they definitely have a lot of acids in them, and the acids, unfortunately, if you drink too much of them, will start to corrode down this enamel layer. Not only that, but there are a lot of times there are those teeth whitening products out there that specialize in trying to obviously whiten your teeth, but a lot of times some when the directions say to leave them on for 2 or 3 minutes, they really mean it, because if you leave those whitening chemicals on your teeth for so long, some people think that, oh, if I leave them overnight, then it definitely will become super white in the morning. The problem is that the chemicals will start to corrode into your teeth, and eventually this enamel layer is going to be gone. And when it's gone, any cold foods that you drink or drinks that you drink down, or any cold foods that you consume down, will start to irritate and sting. It feels like a sting of sharp pain in your teeth. So definitely want to make sure that you maintain this enamel layer as best as you can. Also, we definitely have the pulp region right here, which contains a lot of the vessels within them. The gingiva, definitely those are the gums. We have the cementum, the root canal here. And we have the periodontal membrane. Periodontal membrane, so you can medically break that down. Definitely have the bones here, and then have the blood vessels and nerves that are attached to the tooth in order to in order to supply them with nutrients. Your teeth, even though they may be bone, they may be hard like a rock, but they still need nutrients in order to give them that nice sturdy structure. The upper portion here that's facing out is known as the crown, and anything within the jaw is known as the root. Now, your mouth, you definitely know, is not dry. It contains a lot of these liquid enzymes in order to keep your mouth moist, and it doesn't tear your skin inside. Your tissues inside. Those are the salivary glands. These will be known as a type of exocrine glands, and these release out those digestive enzymes I've mentioned about, for example, amylase. There are 3 different salivary glands in the human mouth, one of which here is known as the parotid gland, which is right over here. That would be the parotid gland. Next one, we have the sublingual gland. And you kind of want to know, why is it called sublingual? Because check this out. Your tongue is right over here. It's pretty much right beneath your tongue. And the next one here, we have the submandibular gland. The submandibular gland is right below your mandibles or your lower jaw. Now, one of the amazing things here is that every once in a while, your salivary gland obviously is going to excrete out enzymes into your mouth to keep it moist. Mine aren't doing a very good job right now, which is probably why I'm pausing once in a while. But salivary glands normally will release out, obviously, the saliva. And once in a while, you might have experienced this while you're talking. All of a sudden, a spray of saliva just starts shooting on out of your mouth. And how embarrassing is that if you were in front, say, in an interview or something, you start to have that saliva shoot. That's known as cleeking. And that's normal. Now the pharynx here, moving on down past the oral cavity, we definitely come across the common passageway for both air and food. You breathe in air through your nose, has to pass through a passageway, and definitely swallow food in through your mouth. It also passes through a common passageway. That here is known as the pharynx with the P. What's amazing here is that once you chew your food, it forms into this mass known as the bolus. And you can see here this green blob in the diagram. That is the bolus. And then the food here, there are 2 pipes. One goes into the respiratory system. As you can see, this pipe here in the front goes down into the respiratory. The other pipe here goes down into the digestive system. In a later image here to the right, you can see that that bolus of food is definitely going on down there. Now, have you ever wondered, why is it that the food goes into the back tube? Why is your digestive tube in the back and not the front? Okay, why isn't this one here the esophagus, and that one there is the trachea? Why not? One of the reasons that is hypothesized is because when you swallow food, just think about squeezing a tube of toothpaste. When you squeeze, that toothpaste is going to shoot out into the back. When you're swallowing, you're very much like squeezing that toothpaste. It shoots the food into the back, and it makes sense that the esophagus be in the back side of the mouth and not the front side. Can you imagine if you were to swallow food if you had your, let me draw the picture here for you. If you had your mouth here and you swallow food, then it had to take a take a U-turn or left turn here to get that wouldn't make any sense. It would be quite, it would cause more choking. So it makes more sense to have the esophagus in the back. Right. Now, once the food passes down through the esophagus, once again, that process of squeezing that food down that tubing to your stomach is known as peristalsis. Okay, and that esophagus here is a 9 to 10 inch muscular tube that extends from the pharynx to the stomach. Once again, that mass of food is known as a bolus, and the stomach contains three parts. The first here is known as the fundus, because that's where all the fun happens. No, I'm kidding. It's just known as the fundus. The next one here is known as the body, and the last region of the stomach here is known as the antrum. Amazingly, obviously, your body, your stomach is going to start churning and start crushing and mushing all of the food in your stomach. There's a lot of acidic chemicals inside of your stomach, like hydrochloric acid is definitely in there, lots of enzymes. If it's squeezing and it's pushing and doing all this stuff in your stomach, there's a chance that all those liquids are going to splatter out. Maybe it might splash out into the esophagus, or it might splatter out into the small intestines here. Okay, so there's a chance that might do that. So one of the things that helps to kind of close off the stomach so it can do its job is known as a lower esophageal sphincter, or known as the cardiac sphincter. When that's closed, it allows for the stomach to kind of mush and the acidic liquids don't splash out. What ends up happening here is that if your lower esophageal sphincter is very weak and the acid starts splashing out into the esophagus, what's going to end up happening is that the acid is going to start to burn that region of the stomach. And do you know what that's called when your acid starts to burn your esophagus? That's known as heartburn. Next one here, we have the pyloric sphincter, which closes off access from the stomach into the small intestine. And that makes sense because the small intestine needs to be ready to receive very small digested down molecules of the food that you eat. But if you throw in like a slice of banana in there, the small intestine is going to have a hard time absorbing the energy from that. So it makes sense. The pyloric sphincter will remain closed until all the food, until the stomach says, hey, you know what? I'm ready to send you on down. You're small enough. So here's the overview of the digestive tract here. We definitely saw this in the introductory slide. We have here the pharynx, which is that common passageway. Here we have the epiglottis, one thing that wasn't mentioned. Again, you have your respiratory tract and your digestive tract that connects together at the pharynx. In order to prevent the food from going down the wrong path, okay, you have the epiglottis. Okay, we have the epiglottis that prevents that food from going there. Is it 100% perfect? No. If it were 100% perfect, we wouldn't have the Heimlich maneuver where an individual, a healthcare professional, would press against your diaphragm and the lower portions of your lung to try to force food on out from your trachea because it went down the wrong pipe. But the epiglottis mainly functions, or purposefully functions, to prevent foods from entering into the trachea, the wrong pipe. It closes off that trachea as you swallow food. Definitely have the esophagus here. We definitely have the stomach. Have the liver right over here. Stomach's right over here. We definitely have your intestines. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. And we have the pancreas, which is very involved in insulin regulation, insulin production, and all these other endocrine hormone secretions. We'll talk more about that a little bit. Okay, so the epiglottis is right over here. Now, once the foods have finished digesting down, the stomach will send a chemical signal to open, okay, to open that pyloric sphincter to allow food to go through into the small intestine. Now, once the food lands itself into the small intestine, that's when the absorption process begins. And in the intestine, we have a lot of these little villi. Okay, these structures in here are known as villi, and each individual finger-like structure is known as a villus. You remember from the previous chapter, us is a singular form and I is a plural form. Now these villi line all over the small intestinal wall, and one of the reasons why, if you think about it, the villi's functions to increase surface area surface area for more efficient absorption. Okay, so that's a big concept here. It increases the surface area. So just imagine this. Imagine there was a bucket of paint where the paint represented the food and you had a potato. If I were to take a potato, if I were to take this potato and I dipped it into a bucket of paint and I lifted it up, agree with me that X amount of food paint is on this potato. If I were to go and take another same size potato out and chop it in half and dip those two halves into the paint, you would definitely have to agree with me that there's a little bit more paint compared to before. Let's take the same size potato again and chop it into quarters. Definitely you would agree with me, if I were to dip that into a bucket of paint and put them out, much more paint would be surrounding that potato. That's what these villi are doing. The smaller, the more fingers that you see in here, the better absorption you're going to get of the food, just like the potato analogy that I just gave you. Excuse me. This absorbs digested nutrients into the bloodstream and the lymph vessels, and it gets absorbed into these capillaries. Now the capillaries here, we'll learn about this in the circulatory system. The capillaries are the smallest types of vessels that are one cell, red blood cell in width, that allows for the best and most efficient transfer of nutrients from the blood into your tissues. Quite amazing, isn't it? Now, after all that's said and done, after all the absorption of the majority of the foods that you eat, sometimes you do have some leftovers. So now we're going to go into the large intestine. Another word for the large intestine, also known as the colon. And now the large intestine here extends from the end of the ileum to the anus. And the large intestine receives fluid waste from digestion and stores it until it can be released from the body. Now, as you can see here, the foods are being released out into this region here known as the cecum, and then it goes up the colon, which is known as the ascending colon. And then it goes across the colon, which is known as the transverse colon. You get where I'm going with this? Next, the food's going to go down the colon, which is known as the descending colon. And then it's going to take, some sort of S turn there, which is known as the sigmoid colon with an S. And then finally, the concentrated feces there, it parks itself here at the rectum and awaits to be released out here, passes through the anus. Big misconception. Feces does not park itself against the edge of the anus. Okay? I just want to be very clear with that. The feces is actually stored much more inland, or much more internally in the rectum, which is several inches in there. And it's not until the body's ready to release that this peristalsis action happens in the large intestine to squeeze out the feces. But the feces just doesn't park itself against the anus. If that were the case, we would all stink. Okay, so it doesn't do that. So I just want to make sure that we clarify that. Okay. One thing that I forgot to mention, in the small intestine, here, the small intestine can be broken up into several different portions. The first portion here is known as the duodenum. So we have here the stomach. So let's kind of imagine here the stomach. Here it is. And then here is your small intestine. The first part here is known as the duodenum. And a lot of your liver, your gallbladder, your pancreas is all attached to the duodenum, the very first section of the small intestine. And that makes sense. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Their foods at that point in the stomach are so acidic that as soon as they land into the small intestine, you would think that it's going to start to burn your small intestine, and it actually can do that. However, you have different organs that will help to neutralize those acids. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next up, the food passes through through the jejunum. The second part here is known as the jejunum. And then the last part here, before it lands itself into the large intestine, oops, it's not going to do that, oops, large intestines, would be known as the ileum. Okay, so you have the stomach, then you have the small intestine. Small intestine is broken down into three parts. The first one is the duodenum, second part is the jejunum, and the third part is the ileum. Bam, bam, bam. Finally, it goes into the large intestine. Let's go ahead and talk about that duodenum region and what organs are attached there. First of which, we definitely have the liver. Okay, we have the gallbladder, which is also attached there, and we have the pancreas, which is also attached. So three main organs that are attached to the duodenum region right over here. As you can see, the duodenum is labeled right there in our diagram. Let's go ahead and talk about the liver. The liver here functions as a detoxification organ. So whenever there are any toxins inside the human system, the liver functions to neutralize those toxins or to remove them out from the body and expel them out through urine or through whatever. The liver is also responsible for a lot of the protein synthesis out there, synthesizing proteins from amino acids and the production of biochemicals necessary for digestion. For example, liver helps to manufacture bile, which helps to break down lipids and fats. And that makes sense. Imagine this, most of your foods here are water compatible or hydrophilic. So whenever you drink water, they mix up very well. However, the fats have a problem. If you try to mix them in with just water, which is what most of your foods are made of, they don't mix very well. If you don't believe me, go find some olive oil or any kind of oil, put them in a bottle that you're not going to use anymore with water, close it up and try to mix it up. Try to mix it the best you can. Try to get a homogeneous mixture out of that. You're probably not going to get it, okay? But I dare you, and I bet you that you won't be able to do it, okay? The body has the same issue. It can't mix fats with water very well. So in order to break down those massive fat globules, your liver has to synthesize and produce that bile in order to get in the middle, get in between those globs and start to break them down to smaller pieces. Next up, we have the gallbladder, which helps to store and concentrate bile for later use. Once again, your body doesn't know exactly how much bile to produce. It knows to produce it because you're eating food, but how much? Doesn't know. So any excess has to go into the gallbladder. And then lastly, we have the pancreas, which secretes out pancreatic juices for further digestion. Now the digestive process, which bile breaks down apart large fat globules and creating more surface area so that these enzymes from the pancreas can further digest these fats, is known as emulsification. Right here, emulsification is that word. What's amazing here is that the duct that connects the liver into the duodenum here is known as the hepatic duct, okay? But then when the gallbladder is involved there, they combine into this common duct. You can see in my diagram that is known as a common bile duct, where the liver and the gallbladder use that same passageway to deliver bile into your small intestines. Once again, just to review, a liver produces that bile, helps to maintain normal blood glucose levels, also manufactures blood proteins necessary for clotting, okay? And it releases this pigment molecule known as bilirubin from dead or dying red blood cells. That pigment is known as bilirubin, and of course it removes out toxins and poisons from the blood. Now, just a little bit of extra information. Inside of your cells, inside of your cells, you have, of course, here the nucleus. You have the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but then you have this other structure here known as the smooth ER. Okay, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or known as the smooth ER, is the site that is responsible for detoxification of a lot of the of the chemical toxins out there. Now, an individual who is an alcoholic or drinks a lot of alcohol will have a much more pronounced smooth ER, much larger smooth ER in order to handle the amount of alcohol in there. However, it's not 100% foolproof. Over time, the body becomes desensitized to the toxin, and therefore the toxin, the alcohol, starts to become much more carcinogenic than compared to before. So be very careful out there. If you know someone who's constantly drinking alcohol, you might want to let them know about their smooth ER and how too much alcohol can desensitize them to the detoxification process. So go ahead and talk about the pancreas and its function. The pancreas has uh, two two main functions. It functions here as an exocrine gland, also here as an endocrine gland or an organ. Now, as an exocrine organ, it produces enzymes to digest starch, okay, which is known as which is of course that amylase. Fats here, lipases, lipids, ACE. Just to let you know, any kind of enzyme, okay, ACE is probably an enzyme, okay, if it ends with an ASE, like lipases digest down lipids, or proteases digest down proteins because they're enzymes, or amylases here in this case will digest down starch. It also functions as an endocrine gland, which it secretes out insulin. Okay, and insulin is a hormone responsible for allowing your cells to intake in glucose from your bloodstream. I like to think of insulin as very much like the spoon for the cells. Without insulin, they can't spoon in glucose into their system. I would definitely want to know this pathway. Very important here. Just to kind of overview, the food here enters into your oral cavity, then it passes through the pharynx, which is a common passageway. Then it goes here into the esophagus, and then the stomach, where it digests down a lot of the foods there. Then it passes here into the small intestine, where it goes into the first of the three regions known as the duodenum. Now, the liver and the gallbladder produces that bile in order to help break down those fat globules. And the pancreas here releases out a lot of those enzymes out there. Now, the bile is also responsible for neutralizing the acids that are inside of that are part of the foods that come out of your stomach. Then next it passes through the jejunum and then the ileum, and then finally it gets into the large intestine here, where it goes into the cecum. Then it goes up the colon, or the ascending colon, goes across, which is the transverse colon, and then goes right back down through the descending colon, and then takes an S turn, which is known as the sigmoid colon. And then lastly, the food there parks into the rectum, where it awaits for the signal to get released out here through the anus. And of course, that leftover concentrated food would be known as feces. Some vocabulary words I would definitely want to know. I'm not going to go through all of these. Definitely in your study time, you will need to go through all of these terms, but I'm going to go ahead and highlight some good ones here that I would definitely want to know. For example, I would definitely want to know cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine. I would want to know colon, okay, which consists of the ascending, transverse, descending, and then the sigmoid segment. We definitely have the duodenum here, which is the first part of the small intestine, measures around a foot long or 12 inches long. We definitely have the esophagus right over here, which is the tube connecting the throat to the stomach. We have the gallbladder, which is the small sac under the liver, and that stores bile, excess bile. We have ileum, which is that third part of the large intestine. We have the pancreas here, which is that organ under the stomach that produces the insulin and the enzyme. Now let's go back a slide here. You might want to know liver, which is that large organ located in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen, which secretes out bile and stores sugar, iron, and vitamins, produces blood proteins, and destroys worn out red blood cells, which is why when the liver breaks down that red blood cell, it releases out that bilirubin pigment molecule. I would definitely want to know peristalsis, which is that rhythmic contraction of the tubular organs. Going back a slide. Oh, let's go on. I would definitely want to know the pharynx, or how about this one? I would definitely want to know what the pyloric sphincter here is, which is that ring of muscle at the end of the stomach near the duodenum, opens when a wave of peristalsis passes over it. I would definitely here want to know uh, the saliva, which is that digestive juice that is produced by this salivary glands. Right there, salivary glands contains the enzyme amylase. I would definitely want to know the rectum, which is that last section of the large intestine connecting the end of the colon and the anus. You might want to know what the sphincter here is, which is that circular ring of muscles that constricts a passage or closes a natural opening. I would definitely here might want to know what the uvula is. Okay, the uvula, ovula, I call it uvula, which is that soft tissue hanging from the middle of the soft pad. It looks like a punching bag. You might even see some cartoons where they kind of make that analogy. Right. Now the next part, we're going to go ahead and look at some additional combining forms. You might see some repeats from the previous chapter, that's okay, but we're more specifically going to look at combining forms that you'll see most commonly used for the digestive system. For example, appendo or appendico means appendix. For example, you probably remember a lot of friends back in maybe 4th grade or 5th grade, and you probably heard of appendicitis. You probably heard of the word appendicitis, which means inflammation of the appendix. And so when an individual has inflammation in the appendix, they have to get the appendix removed or excised out. What do you suppose a medical term for that is? That's correct, appendectomy. Next, we have celio, which means belly or abdomen. Some additional terms here. Chilo, excuse me. Chilo, here, chilo means lip. And we have choledocho. Choledocho here means common bile duct. So one word here that you might be curious about is choledochotomy. Choledochotomy means incision of the common bile duct. We definitely here have cholo, which means colon. So if you have an inflammation of the colon, you would have colitis. Another one for colon here is colono. Now keep this in mind, colonitis is not what's used in the field. For you at home, you're probably thinking, why don't I just call it colonitis? And maybe it sounds better. That's not the case. You always want to use the word that's used most often in the field. In this case, it's colitis. Another one here is entero, which means intestines, usually referring to the small intestine. So what is enterocolitis? Enterocolitis means inflammation of the small and large intestines. Now, another word here that you're not going to see in the textbook, I'm going to tell you, might want to know is etiology. And etiology here means a study of the cause of disease. Some additional combining forms that you might want to know here. Glosso. Glosso here means tongue. Or hepato here means liver. For example, you've probably heard of this one, hepatitis. Hepatitis means inflammation of the liver, and there are many different versions of hepatitis. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, so on and so forth. There's also another one here, hepatomegaly. Wow, that's a mouthful. Hepatomegaly, what does this mean? It means enlargement of the liver. Another term here, another combining form is jejuno, which means jejunum, and you might want to know this term. This is a very long term. Choledocho jejunostomy. What a mouthful. Choledocho jejunostomy means new opening between the common bile duct and the jejunum. Another one here, labio here means lip. Now there are two references to the combining form labio. In this chapter, it means the lips. We have another one here, laparo, which means the abdomen. We have another one, we have linguo here, which means tongue. More combining forms we definitely have here. Oro, which means mouth. For example, oral. Oral means pertaining to the mouth. We definitely have palato. Palato here means palate. So, for example, palatoplasty. Palatoplasty means surgical repair of the roof of the mouth. Protoneo means protoneum, and protoneum, for example, protonitis. Protonitis here means inflammation of the membrane around the abdomen. We have another one here, which salideno, which means salivary gland. For example, if we have the inflammation of the salivary gland, that would be salidinitis. Salidinitis is inflammation of the salivary gland. We have another combining form is stomato. Stomato here means mouth. So stomatitis means inflammation of the mouth. Other additional ones here, we definitely have chole. Chole here means gall or bile. So we have here a term, excuse me, we have here a term, cholecystitis. What does cholecystitis mean? Cholecystitis means inflammation of the gallbladder. Another term here that I would definitely want to know, glycogeno, which also means glycogen or animal starch. Now, there are two types of ways in which organisms can store excess carbohydrates. One is in the form of glycogen, which is us. Plants don't store it as a form of glycogen, they store it in the form of starch. So be careful whenever someone says, oh, well, I can store it in as starch. That's wrong. We don't store excess carbs as starch, we store them as glycogen. And if you have way too much carbs and our liver is overloaded with this stuff, then it goes into your fat. Okay, we have here steato. Steato here means fat. So what does steatorrhea mean? Let's write that down. Steatorrhea is a condition where you have fat in your feces. Whoa. All right, just to kind of review here, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, if you see the suffix is ase, that means enzyme. Chesia here means defecation, elimination of waste, and prandial here it means meal. For example, postprandial. means pertaining to after meals or just after meals. Or preprandial means before meals. Okay, so some cases here. When stomy is used with two or more combining forms or organs, it means a surgical creation of an opening between those organs inside the body. For example, anastomosis is a surgical connection between two body parts, such as vessels, ducts, or bowel segments. So this would be here anastomoses. And there are three different kinds of anastomoses, one of which is end to end. Okay, so you can see here we have one end of the intestine and another end coming together. They're surgically sewed together. Excuse me. Another one here is end to the side. Okay, and the last one here is side to side. They're sewed in together. All right, let's move on to the next lesson where we talk about some of the pathology that the digestive system has. Once again, the digestive system is not perfect. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes the digestive system doesn't function the way it's supposed to. We're going to get into that. That's pathology. One of which here is anorexia. This one, I'm pretty sure that most of you, the students out there have heard. Anorexia means a lack of appetite. Another one here is ascites, which means the abnormal accumulation of fluid in the abdomen. And whenever your stomach starts to rumble or gurgle or makes that noise produced by gas movement or fluid or anything in the GI tract, it's known as borborygmus or borborygmi. And when an individual has difficulty trying to pass stool, stool is another word for feces. Excuse me. Stool is another word for feces. That is when a person is constipated, and of course the opposite of being constipated is when when the feces is constantly coming out. That would be known as diarrhea, or frequent passage of loose, watery stool. Other ones here. If an individual has difficulty swallowing their food, that would be known as dysphagia. Not dysphagia. Sometimes it could be painful. Eructation here is when gas is expelled from the stomach through the mouth. Kind of like burping. It is burping. Now here's another one. I hope that you are flattered with this word. It's known as flatus, is when a gas is expelled not through your mouth but through the other side, through your anus. That is known as flatus. So don't get flattered by that. It's flatus. Now hematochezia is passage of fresh, bright red blood from the rectum. And jaundice or icterus, okay, that's another term for that, is when you have yellow-orange coloration in the skin and whites of the eyes caused by high levels of bilirubin in the blood. Now, melena is black tarry stools where feces contains digested blood. A lot of times melena a result of a tear may result from a tear in the large intestine. That is further inward. Okay, so you definitely have the digestive tract, you have this large intestine. If you have a cut or an incision or some sort of hemorrhoid or anything that's way up there in the large intestine, what's going to happen is that as the blood is leaking out, it's pouring out in there, it starts to pass through the large intestine, and the large intestine starts to digest them out, which is why they appear black when they come out the other end. However, if you have a hemorrhoid or a cut that is toward the anus, then there's more chance that the blood won't get digested yet, so when it comes out, it will appear as red. Nausea here is an unpleasant sensation in the stomach associated with the tendency to vomit. And of course, I mentioned steatorrhea. Here's fat in the feces. And of course, our textbook is very descriptive on describing that as being very frothy, foul-smelling fecal matter. So you might want to know those descriptions. Other pathological conditions here, we have The aphthostomatitis, which is inflammation of the mouth with small painful ulcers. Dental caries, which is tooth decay, also known as cavities. Okay. Herpetic stomatitis is inflammation of the mouth by infection of the herpes simplex virus. We also have oral leukoplakia, which is white plaques or patches in the mouth. And you have periodontal disease, which is inflammation and degeneration of the gums, teeth, and surrounding bone. Achalasia is a failure of the lower esophagus sphincter or the LES muscle to relax. As you can see here, as a bolus is going through, it doesn't relax, and so therefore it might end up getting some issues in this region. Another one here is esophageal cancer. Esophageal cancer here is a malignant tumor of the esophagus. Esophageal varices is when you have swollen varicose veins at the lower end of the esophagus, and of course gastro means stomach. Gastric carcinoma means malignant tumor of the stomach. So as you can see here, the esophageal varices, we have dilated veins that are in there. Gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, okay, I definitely would want to know this one, is when you have solid and fluids return to the mouth from the stomach. Oh. And then another one here is peptic ulcer, which is open sore or lesion of the mucous membrane of the stomach or the duodenum. A hernia is a protrusion of organ or part of it through a muscle that normally contains it. You can see here we have an esophageal hernia where we have part of the esophageal wall that's protruding outward over here. We can also have another kind of hernia, which is inguinal, indirect inguinal hernia, where there's a rupture here in the membrane, abdominal membrane, and then parts of the intestine start to kind of protrude itself on outward in here. And what's pretty interesting is when they start to protrude outward and then into the groin. This is here known as the male scrotum, and you can see here the esophagus is just kind of, not the esophagus, I'm sorry, the small intestine is just kind of protruding outward into there. So this is quite uncomfortable. And a lot of times what physicians will do to take care of this is they will push the large intestine or whatever intestine back in, and then they'll put a sort of metal grating or padding here to prevent that from protruding out, because once the membrane has a weak portion in its wall, there's very little or close to no way in which to re-strengthen that membrane back. So the physicians have to put in that metal grating in there in order to prevent the intestines from pushing through. A lot of time what can result from that is when, say that you're coughing, like I just did earlier, when you're coughing or sneezing, when you do that, you push a lot of pressure in with your diaphragm, which can push that large intestine to regions it's not supposed to. An anal fistula here is an abnormal tube-like passageway near the anus, and colonic polyposis here is when you have polyps that protrude from the mucous membranes in the colon. A lot of times, a lot of individuals who are in their later ages, for example, in their 40s or 50s, a lot of times are more prone to having a colonic polyposis. Colorectal cancer here is adenocarcinoma of the colon or the rectum or both. As you can see here, we have an image of the interior here of the colon, and you can see this red, really bright red region here is where you see cancerous or carcinomic tissue. We have here Crohn's disease, excuse me. Crohn's disease, which is chronic inflammation of the intestinal tract. We have diverticulosis, which is abnormal side pockets or outpouchings in the intestinal wall. We have here dysentery, which is painful, inflamed intestine. Hemorrhoids is another one here. Hemorrhoids, where's my pen? Hemorrhoids here is when you have swollen, twisted varicose veins in the rectal region. These a lot of times can bust open, leading to bleeding in the rectal region. Now, if of course, as I mentioned, if the bleeding is more further in, the feces will come out looking cherry charred black. If it's toward the anus, it's going to look bright red. And we have here inflammatory bowel. I'm going to skip a couple of these. You can read that on your own, but we definitely here have inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, which is inflammation of the colon and the small intestine. We have here IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. It's a group of gastrointestinal syndromes associated with stress and tension. We have ulcerative colitis, which is chronic inflammation of the colon with the presence of ulcers. Next up, we have here a cirrhosis, which is a chronic degenerative disease of the liver, and the causes here is chronic alcoholism. So as you can see here, alcohol is again a carcinogenic toxin. Cirrhosis results from malnutrition, hepatitis, and a lot of other conditions there. And also, lobes of the liver are covered with a fibrous tissue, hepatic cells degenerate, and the liver there is infiltrated with fats. So a pretty serious condition there. Pancreatitis here is inflammation, of course, of the pancreas, and viral hepatitis is the inflammation of the liver caused by a virus. Cholelithiasis here is gallstones in the gallbladder, and biliary colic, which means pain from a blocked cystic or common bile duct. So again, the type of surgery that is performed to remove the gallbladder and stones is known as laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So here we go. That would be that. Oops, that would be that surgery right over there. Well, I hope that you found this lecture informative. You found that the pathology here is very interesting and informative. We're just starting to get our feet wet in here. Lots more different kinds of pathologies out there, but this is just kind of getting started. Next, chapter 6, we'll talk a little bit more, actually a lot more about the digestive system, and then we'll just kind of end the digestive system pretty much after that chapter. So if you have any questions or comments, let me know about them, and I will see you in the next lecture. Until then, Professor Doe here. I am signing out.